Hello and welcome back to St. Anne's Small Groups. Today we begin a new message series called The End, as we focus on where is the Lord leading us. Today and next week we're going to look at what do we become as He transforms us. What does a mature disciple of Jesus look like? Then we'll look at the end of the world and then life beyond that. What is our ultimate destiny? Today, we focus our attention on the Beatitudes, and we heard at Mass how the Beatitudes are kind of that signpost, letting us know what does the heart of a mature disciple look like. What we want to do now is just go through each of those and look at them a little more closely and see what Jesus means by each of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, in the Old Testament, especially back in the book of Genesis, the Israelites tended to view material wealth as a sign of God's blessing and favor. And so it was assumed that those who were wealthy, those who were powerful, were the ones who were closest to God. But then came the Babylonian captivity, when the whole nation was conquered through war and then led off to live in Babylon. And there in Babylon, 90% of them would have been living in poverty. Even after they returned from Babylon, they were living under Persian rule. And because of the Persian tax policy, no one was able to get ahead materially or experience economic prosperity. And so this forced them to look deeper into what it meant to be favored by God. The later Psalms reflect this notion and see the poor as God's favored people. They recognized that the poor, because of their humility, are often closer to God. Christians don't understand this poverty as simply a material poverty. Paul, especially in his letters to the Galatians and the Romans, reflects on the fact that he has nothing to offer to God. He has nothing to give, nothing to boast about. All of his works, the travels that he did and the sufferings that he endured to be able to share the gospel, he says those don't really belong to him. They come from God. God has been working in him. He relies totally on the grace and favor of God for his worth and for his justification. But this poverty isn't purely spiritual either. While everyone's not called to radical poverty, to live in total solidarity with the poor, the church always needs to have disciples who voluntarily live in that total solidarity. And each one of us as well should practice some form of asceticism, denying ourselves certain things, giving things up, and should recognize that everything that we have belongs to God. Someone who is poor in spirit is a passionate lover of God who wants to let God bestow his favors on them. Someone who is poor in spirit is a passionate lover of God who wants to let God bestow his favors on them. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Mourning is the sadness that we experience when there's something wrong. There are two kinds of mourning. The first is the mourning that is without hope. This is not from God. The second, Pope Benedict describes as a mourning occasioned by the shattering encounter with truth, which leads man to undergo conversion and to resist evil. Judas is the example of the first. Judas knows that he's sinned by betraying Jesus, and he mourns, he's sad for it, but he doesn't believe that there is any hope for him, no way for him to be reconciled to Jesus, and so he takes his own life. Peter, on the other hand, Peter also denies Jesus, also sins against Jesus, but Peter looks Jesus in the eye. He knows that he's done wrong, and as he looks Jesus in the eye, he's moved to tears and he's moved to conversion. He mourns for his sin, but trusting in the power of God to reconcile him. Those who mourn weep for their sins and the sins of the world. Those who mourn refuse to accept evil, and because of that will be persecuted. Those who mourn weep for their sins and the sins of the world. Those who mourn refuse to accept evil. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. This beatitude is closely linked to the first. Meekness is an essential aspect of what it means to be poor in spirit. The Old Testament describes Moses as the most meek. Now, Moses, of course, is not wimpy. He's a great leader. He has great influence over the people. He's able to do some awesome things and to lead in some very courageous ways. But he does so without force and without military might. He led very humbly. Zechariah, the prophet, foretells the coming of a king who in his meekness will enter the city riding on an ass rather than on a horse. And that passage, of course, is fulfilled by Jesus on Palm Sunday. One who is meek exercises great influence through poverty and humility. One who is meek exercises great influence through poverty and humility. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. This is related to the beatitude about those who mourn. Here too, Jesus is praising those who choose righteousness over the values of this world. But this one has kind of an added aspect of longing, of looking out for something else. Here, Jesus is talking about those whose interior sensitivity enables them to see and to hear the subtle signs that God sends into the world to break the dictatorship of convention. Someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness isn't satisfied with the way things are, but rather recognizes that God is calling the world to conversion and longs to see that day. Someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness recognizes that God is calling this world to conversion and longs to see that day. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Mercy is the form that love takes when it meets some kind of human suffering. And so if someone is hungry, we give them food. If someone is naked, we give them clothing. If someone is ignorant, we instruct them. Of course, the greatest form of human suffering is sin. And so the greatest form of mercy is forgiveness. Jesus, of course, shows this in the greatest way as he hangs upon the cross that we could be forgiven, and has even asked the Father to forgive those who are crucifying him. But Jesus performs other acts of mercy as well throughout his life, feeding those who are hungry, instructing those who are ignorant, counseling those who are doubtful and need to be reassured of their faith, healing those who are sick, and so on. Jesus is very merciful and calls us always to be merciful. And as we walk with him, we become merciful. To be merciful means that we recognize the needs of others and work to meet those needs. To be merciful means to recognize the needs of others and work to meet those needs. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. You know, I look around this church, I'm able to see different things with my eyes, the pillars, the walls, the artwork. But the organ for seeing God is not the eye, and it's not the brain, it's the heart. A person can only see God if his will is pure. As we heard a couple of weeks ago, seek first the kingdom of God, or you never will, because God refuses to be number two. In the Psalms, to be pure of heart means that someone keeps the commandments. And the Psalms say that the one who has clean hands and a pure heart will be able to enter into the temple of God and to see God face to face. For Jesus, we become pure of heart not so much by following a list of rules, but by following him. And as we talk with Christ, as we walk with Christ, as we live a life of prayer, we become one with him. And so St. Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The clean of heart are those who walk with Christ and desire what he desires, to be with God. The clean of heart are those who walk with Christ and desire what he desires, to be with God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Throughout the Old Testament, God often promises peace, yet the Jews experience very little of it because they don't know what it takes to live in peace. The peace God wants to give is first peace with himself. This is why Jesus focuses his teaching most on the mercy of God and his desire to reconcile us to himself. St. Paul also begins many of his letters by urging us to be reconciled to God. Pope Benedict says, the Christian knows that lasting peace is connected with men abiding in God's eudokia, or his good pleasure. This peace is pure gift from God. We can't earn it, we can't achieve it, we receive it. However, God does not just want us to be at peace with him, but he also wants peace on earth. He wants us to be at peace with one another. And that kind of peace requires more of our cooperation, to be peacemakers, not just peace receivers. But these aren't really two separate things. When we're at peace with God, it's very easy to be at peace with others. And when we lose sight of God, peace on earth decays into violence. Peacemakers receive God's peace and share it with others. Peacemakers receive God's peace and share it with others. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This beatitude is closely related to number 2, blessed are those who mourn. Righteousness is Old Testament language for fidelity to God's law, but in the New Testament, righteousness is usually associated with faith, walking with Christ, trusting in his plan for our lives. Those who live by faith do not conform to this world, and so will always be persecuted by the world. Those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness are those who embrace Christ, those who adhere to Christ, and because of that will never quite fit in this world. Those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness are those who adhere to Christ, embrace Christ, and because of that will never quite fit in this world. These are the Beatitudes. They sound kind of like commandments, but they're not really commandments. They're promises. Promises of where the Lord is leading us. And if we follow Christ, if we live a life of prayers, we seek to imitate him day after day, we find that these Beatitudes just kind of become a part of the way that we live. We don't even have to try so much or make an intentional effort. They just happen. But Jesus also attaches to them a promise of blessing. And he's able to do that because he's learned from experience. He knows that in his life, every time he experiences one of these things, as he is poor in spirit, rejecting earthly riches, as he mourns for the sins of the world, and so on, over and over again, the Father extends his blessing, his generosity, his favor to him. And he prefers that. He prefers the blessing of the Father over the things of this world. And so should we. And so can we, as our Lord purifies our hearts.